Hey everybody, it's Rabbit. Welcome back to the channel, and today we're going to be reviewing the PLZ83-130 event vehicle for China. Of course, this is an event vehicle, not a premium vehicle, so if you want the various upgrades and modifications, you are going to have to earn them. They don't come stock, and it doesn't have any special researching bonuses. And of course, jumping right into the vehicle, let's go into its mobility first, and I have to say mobility is probably one of the strongest assets of the 83-130. Despite its somewhat large size, it does have a fairly good engine and can generally accelerate and turn pretty well. It can get up to speeds of around 50 kilometers an hour, and honestly it actually cruises most of the time at around the mid to high 40s, so it's actually pretty good in terms of its forward mobility. It also turns and maneuvers reasonably well thanks to its relatively light weight, although this is due to an overall lack of armor. The only real drawback to the mobility aspect of this vehicle is the reverse gear of a whopping 9 kilometers an hour. However, for a 7.3 vehicle, that's actually pretty average, so it's not that bad, and it does accelerate backwards reasonably quickly, so you can at least get out of danger if you are relatively close to some form of solid cover reasonably efficiently. While the 83-130 isn't without some numerous flaws, which we'll get into in a minute, I would say the mobility definitely isn't one of them, and this is more than acceptable in terms of mobility for its battle rating. It actually does maneuver quite well. That being said, I am a lot less complimentary on the armor aspect of the vehicle. In terms of protection, the 83-130 is severely lacking in basically every way you can. The only way the protection could possibly get worse is if it was open-topped, and honestly you'll die to so many things that are relatively light that you will feel like you are open-topped in this vehicle. The turret is absolutely massive, and the turret can also be penned by basically everything except for rifle caliber machine guns. 50 cals, Dishkas, any high explosive round whatsoever, all of them will go straight through it like a hot knife through butter, and unfortunately for you, that is where 4 out of your 5 crew members are located, so you can be efficiently killed through your turret. On top of that, all of your ammunition is stowed in the back of the turret, so you can't necessarily rely on over penetration, as even if it doesn't generate a ton of shrapnel, as long as the shell does directly hit one of the rounds in the back of the turret, it will still knock you out regardless. The hull is not particularly well protected, but it is at least more well protected than the turret, so it would definitely be a mistake for any opponent to shoot the PLZ there, but some people do occasionally do, and that only really knocks out your mobility. However, this is a bit of a problem because obviously you can be 50 cal'd, and if you run into Russians or USA, they're probably going to have a roof-mounted heavy machine gun that can just gun down your turret crew regardless, so it doesn't benefit you that much for them to knock out your driver and engine when they can just machine gun down your entire turret crew. Normally with these types of big light vehicles, I do like to turn them side on, so that gives the opponent more opportunities to miss critical components, but I did anecdotally find this didn't work all that well with the PLZ83 because the side aspect of the armor in the hull actually does produce some pretty efficient shrapneling, and either side of the turret is probably going to knock you out, either outright kill you or completely disable you, so this tactic almost never resulted in any meaningful increase in survivability. Of course, this does wrap around to one of the single biggest frustrations I had and that you will likely have playing this vehicle, and that is CAS. If any person that you take out has thought about a plane at any point in their lifespan, you will inevitably have one plane coming for you at the very beginning of the match, even if it doesn't have any suspended ordnance, because pretty much everybody recognizes that you're a very easy target, so they don't even bother coming in with rockets or bombs, they just gun you down through the turret. Occasionally, CAS players will make you feel a little bit better by at least hitting you with bombs or rockets, but far too often people will just fire 1 or 2 quick bursts of cannon or machine gun fire into the turret and completely knock the vehicle out. This isn't helped at all by the fact that the vehicle is absolutely massive, or at least the turret is massive. The hull is fairly long, but it's also pretty low to the ground, but the turret is an absolute house, much like the FE4005, so it's very difficult to hide it or keep it from getting hit by enemy fire. While I won't say the PLZ83 is the worst vehicle I have ever experienced in terms of durability, it's actually pretty close. The only thing that occasionally allows you to survive shots is your relatively large crew, and even then that's usually temporary, as you often get knocked out not soon after by enemy machine guns. Of course, with the PLZ8130, the big aspect that everybody's interested in is the firepower, the 130mm cannon. The 130mm cannon comes with a base reload of around 15 seconds, which is fairly long even for this battle rating and even with a lot of the heavy tanks. You're about on par with a lot of the Soviet 122s and vehicles like the American T-32, which are all infamously long in terms of their reload. A lot of the 90 and 105mm you'll run into, and even the Russian 100mm, will all pretty comfortably beat you to the punch if you don't disable the enemy in the first shot. The 83-130 also has a pretty abysmal turret rotation rate at only around 7 degrees a second, and also has a pretty poor elevation rate as well, although the rotation you can actually kind of sort of fix with the hull, because the hull rotation rate is actually incredibly good, but this means you almost have to treat it like a casemate tank destroyer in some scenarios, swinging the entire vehicle around to hit a target. That being said, there are definitely times when having a fully traversable turret is definitely a good thing, and I did notice anecdotally the gun depression was better than some equivalent tank destroyers, although still not great by any means. The main shell, and luckily a stock shell, is the APHE shell, which pens over 300mm and has a nice ballistic cap. Now on paper this shell should perform incredibly well, but I found experientially that if you get an opponent with particularly heavy armor and who has at a bit of an angle, you can get some really weird bounces with it, and I'm not entirely sure why this is happening. It feels kind of similar to how the American M103 can sometimes bounce off the upper front plate of a Panther. It just doesn't really make a whole lot of sense, but on the whole, the shell does perform reasonably well, and it does have enough explosive filler to generally one-hit kill most opponents. That being said, 300mm of penetration ironically isn't much of a lull pen round even at this battle rating, as even things like King Tigers, ISs, and Mouses you will have to aim for careful weak points, which does put you at a bit of a disadvantage when all of those vehicles can comfortably kill you just by clicking on the middle of you. The American heavies in particular, the T-32s, ended up being really obnoxious opponents because they both have roof-mounted heavy machine guns, and their upper front plate and even their lower front plate is just barely thick enough that it can actually be kind of frustrating to pen sometimes. All that being said, if it's not a heavy tank, most of the time you can just hit it in the middle and you will absolutely knock it out. So I don't want to give the impression that this shell is unusable by any means, but if you look at it on paper and think this shell can just go through anything, that is kind of not really true. However, one interesting detail I noted is that if you shoot the Mouse's turret cheek, it will basically always kill the entire Mouse turret crew and take out the entire vehicle, which is actually pretty useful given how many vehicles struggle to frontally kill a Mouse without having to kill individual crew members. The 83-130 does have a high explosive round, and I briefly experimented with trying to use this as a main round, only to find out that it actually has pretty lackluster penetration and explosive filler. It only pens about 37mm of armor, which isn't that much more than a traditional high explosive round at this battle rating, and is actually less than the Russian 125, which is a little odd. I'm not actually sure if this is statted correctly, but either way, the high explosive round on this is questionably useful, especially given how long it takes to reload into a high explosive round to engage an opponent. The proximity fuse high explosive round is also questionably useful. There are a few open top vehicles and you can get some cheeky kills around obstacles with it, which is always pretty funny. And in theory you could take out an aircraft, although in practice the turret traverse rate and elevation on the gun made it incredibly difficult to track planes unless I was basically already aiming directly at them. So while I did take a few out and in theory I could have shot some planes down, I in practice never really got into an opportunity where I could actually do it. There is an unlockable smoke round, and normally I take one or two of these utility rounds, except when you have a 15-second reload, it takes forever to get the existing round out of the gun, switch to the smoke, fire the smoke, and then reload a new round. So in general, I just didn't bother taking it on this particular vehicle. The 83-130 also comes with a roof-mounted Dushka, which is always nice to have if aircraft, helicopters, or other light vehicles are harassing you, although in practice a lot of these enemies will kill you a lot faster than you will kill them, but it is at least nice in some situations. Overall, I would rate the firepower as pretty good. If it was a little bit more of a lull pen gun, I would rate the firepower as great, but as it stands, there are just a few too many enemies around this battle rating that can just click on the middle of you and that you have to fire some carefully aimed shots to knock out. In general, if you are looking to use the 83-130, it's typically at its strongest at longer ranges because its gun will generally be effective even at pretty long distances against the vast majority of opponents, especially if you're pretty good at getting the range down. On top of that, your weakness to heavy machine guns is a lot less pronounced at longer ranges where enemies will struggle to hit you with heavy machine guns, so that does at least help you out a bit there. That being said, if you can hide sufficiently well between shots or you have teammates around, it isn't the worst brawler in the world. One thing I noticed about the gun is that while it's not stabilized, it is very stable. It doesn't wobble that much, especially on flat level ground and especially at low speeds. And you can kind of accurately fire snapshots with it, so in urban environments I found it was actually reasonably usable. If the PLZ83-130 was a tech tree vehicle that had its own lineup, I would basically call it fine. It's almost the definition of fine. It's what you generally look to a tank destroyer to be because tank destroyers have a low spawn cost, and you want them to have a gun that is effective in most situations that can get you back in the match, or that can play well into up tiers, and this kind of does both of those. However, it doesn't actually have a lineup, and that's the biggest problem with this vehicle. The two closest vehicles to it are the M48 and the ZTS-63, both at 7.7, except they don't really fill out much of a lineup, and ironically the long-range maps where you take out the 83-130, I would argue the ZTS-63 is actually better because it has the dart and the laser rangefinder. It's not like the situation gets better if you go up to the Chinese 8.0 lineup either, as it just gets more and more obsoleted the further up you go. This severely limits your options of playing the 83-130 to either pulling your entire 6.7 lineup into 7.3 or playing it as a backup to a backup essentially for 7.7 or 8.0, but neither of which are particularly great options. Vehicles that don't have a firm lineup always exist on a bit of a knife's edge where they can easily be obsoleted by the smallest deficiency, and for me the deficiency that led to me not really loving this vehicle and not looking for any way to squeeze it into a lineup was really the inconsistent gun performance on some of the odd armor angles, because ultimately if this isn't one hit killing everything it touches, I don't see any reason to use it. That being said, if China does get a lineup for this thing around these battle ratings, I do think it's not unusable by any stretch of the imagination. You can definitely take it out, you can definitely get some kills with it, you can even have some half decent games in it, at least until the planes show up. So that is at least something to keep an eye on in the future if there is a battle rating change that puts this vehicle at perhaps a better battle rating, where it has a true lineup and at least some opportunity to excel. But that's just my opinion on the 83-130. Feel free to drop a comment telling me if you love it, hate it, or you're indifferent to it and you just don't care. Hope you enjoyed the video. If you did, please leave a like and subscribe. That always helps out the channel. As always, don't get the shoes.